In the late 1930s, the town of Havens-Dusty, Oklahoma, was a place forgotten by God and government. The earth, once fertile, had turned to a fine, choking powder that coated everything in a perpetual layer of beige despair. It filled the lungs of children and settled in the lines on the faces of their gaunt, hollow-eyed parents. Hope was a currency more scarce than water, and the sun was a relentless tyrant in a cloudless sky. Each day was a quiet battle fought in kitchens with empty larders and on porches where families sat in a silence born of hunger. The Great Depression had bled the nation, but here in the Dust Bowl, it had scraped the very marrow from the bone, leaving a community teetering on the precipice of absolute collapse. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low hum of desperation, a collective prayer for a salvation that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive, leaving only the grim calculus of survival. Amidst this landscape of slow starvation stood a single beacon of improbable abundance, Blackwood's butcher shop. While farms withered and livestock perished, Silas Blackwood's establishment remained an oasis of sustenance. The clean, whitewashed facade was a stark contrast to the grimy, dust-caked buildings that flanked it, and the rhythmic, reassuring thud of his cleaver against the great oak block was the town's heartbeat. Silas himself, a man of quiet piety with a smile as gentle as his hands were steady, was seen as a savior. He was the pillar of the community, a man who seemed to conjure forth provisions from the very dust itself. His generosity was legendary. No one in true need was ever turned away, and his actions were seen not merely as charity, but as a divine miracle in a land that had been forsaken by all other forms of grace. Every morning, a line of the town's most destitute would form outside his door, a silent, shuffling procession of human ghosts. They clutched worn burlap sacks and empty tins, their eyes fixed on the entrance with a desperate reverence. A young mother, her face a mask of weary resolve, would step forward, her child clinging to her skirt. Silas would emerge, wiping his hands on a pristine apron, and offer a kind word before handing her a heavy parcel wrapped in brown butcher paper. The package felt impossibly dense, promising a richness of fat and flesh that seemed a fantasy in these lean times. He would ask for nothing in return, simply offering a nod and a blessing. For those who received his charity, the act was a sacrament, a moment of profound relief that overshadowed any need to question the source of such a miraculous, unending supply of meat. Yet, even in this sanctuary of survival, a subtle dissonance lingered, and detail that the town collectively chose to ignore. It was the door to the back room of the shop. Unlike the welcoming entrance, this door was made of heavy, dark wood, its surface stained with years of unknown effluence that had soaked deep into the grain. It was always bolted from the inside. From beneath it, a faint, sweetish odor would sometimes seep, a cloying, almost metallic scent that Silas attempted to mask with the sharp, clean smells of pickling spices and the heavy smoke from his smokehouse. It was a smell that didn't quite belong among the familiar scents of cured pork and damp sawdust, a quiet anomaly in the heart of the town's salvation. The townsfolk, in their desperate gratitude, learned to breathe less deeply when they passed it, their minds refusing to connect the scent to anything unsettling. Today, the butcher shop is a skeletal ruin, its roof long collapsed, its walls surrendering to the relentless wind and time. It is a shunned place, a dark monument on the edge of a town that survived but never truly recovered. The clean, whitewashed facade has peeled away to reveal rotting timber, and the windows are hollow eyes staring out at a landscape that has healed, even if the community has not. The building stands as a physical manifestation of a poisoned memory, a place where the line between salvation and damnation was not just blurred, but erased entirely. It is a source of grim fascination, a historical wound that refuses to scar over, festering in the collective consciousness of Haven's dust, a permanent reminder of the price of survival and the terrible secrets that hunger can conceal from willing eyes. The legend of Silas Blackwood has become a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by grandparents to frighten unruly children. They call him the kindly butcher, a name that has curdled over the decades into a thing of profound irony and horror. On moonless nights, local teenagers dare one another to approach the ruin and touch the splintered remains of the backroom door, the very threshold that separated the town's mundane reality from an unspeakable truth. They speak of a lingering cold spot and a faint, sweet smell that still rises from the parched earth on hot summer days. The story has become a part of the town's identity, a macabre piece of folklore that explains the quiet sadness that hangs over the community, a shadow passed down through generations who learned that the deepest horrors are often disguised as the most benevolent of gifts. This legend is an echo of a real and documented horror, a story that has traveled through time to reach us today. And since these dark histories have a way of connecting the past to the present, we invite you to mark your place in this investigation. Tell us in the comments from which city you are joining our descent into the archives, and the exact time you are watching. With your presence now recorded in our ledger, let us turn back the clock. We must return to the late 1930s, to the suffocating dust of Havens dust, and witness the arrival of the one man who was immune to the town's willful blindness, the man who would eventually notice the first sinister crack in the facade of the kindly butcher. The arrival of Sheriff Lucas Miller in the summer of 1938 was an event of little consequence to the residents of Havens Dust. He was a young man, barely 30, with a jawline as sharp as his gaze, and a uniform that still held the crisp folds of its recent issue. He was an outsider, assigned to this forgotten corner of the county by a distant bureaucracy, and the townspeople regarded him with a passive, weary indifference. They saw him not as a symbol of law or order, but as another transient figure destined to be scoured away by the same relentless wind that stripped the paint from their homes and the hope from their hearts. Miller, however, possessed an unnerving stillness, an observational patience that was alien to the frantic desperation of the Dust Bowl. He saw the town not as a lost cause, but as a closed book, and he intended to read every page, no matter how grim the text. His first official duty was to file a report on the disappearance of a man named Jedediah Kane, an elderly drifter who had been a fixture on the town's periphery for years. When Miller questioned the local pastor, Reverend Thompson, the man offered little more than a resigned sigh, his voice as dry as the cracked leather of his Bible. "Men like Jedediah, Sheriff," Thompson explained, "they are like tumbleweeds. The wind blows, and they move on. He likely caught a ride on a freight train heading for California, searching for work that isn't here." The explanation was logical, almost comforting in its simplicity. It was the accepted narrative for the countless souls who vanished into the vast, indifferent landscape of the Depression. But Miller detected an unsettling finality in the Reverend's tone, an eagerness to close the file on a life that had barely registered as existing in the first place. Unsatisfied with the town's collective shrug, Sheriff Miller decided to retrace what few steps of Jedediah's life he could. He walked the dusty path along the desiccated creek bed where the old man was known to camp. It was there, half swallowed by the fine, ochre-colored silt near the base of an old cottonwood, that he found it, a small, brass harmonica, its surface tarnished and dented from years of use. Miller picked it up, tapping the dust from its reeds. He knew from his brief inquiries that this instrument was Jedediah's sole possession, his only companion through lonely nights. A man with nothing does not voluntarily abandon the one thing he has. It was a small, discordant note in the town's story of a simple departure, a quiet signal that the official version of events was incomplete, perhaps even deliberately false. Miller's investigation inevitably led him to the door of Blackwood's butcher shop, the town's undisputed center of gravity. He entered under the guise of a formal introduction, a courtesy call to a local business owner. He found Silas Blackwood exactly as described, a man of medium height with gentle eyes and hands that, despite their gruesome trade, were immaculately clean. The shop itself was a temple of order amidst the chaos of the outside world. The floors were swept, the counters scrubbed to a pale sheen, and the air was thick with the reassuring sense of sawdust and curing salt. As Silas spoke, his voice calm and measured, the rhythmic thud of his cleaver from the back room provided a steady, almost hypnotic percussion. It was the sound of sustenance, of life being prepared and portioned. It was the sound of survival. The sheriff brought up Jedediah Kane's name casually, noting he was just tidying up some loose ends. Silas's expression shifted to one of practiced piety and sorrow. "Ah, poor Jedediah," he lamented, wiping his hands on his pristine white apron. "A lost soul. He came by the day he left. I gave him a parcel of ground pork and some sausage for his journey. He said he was heading west, hoping to find a place where the rain still falls. The butcher's account was seamless, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who was a pillar of his community. Yet, as Miller listened, he observed a curious detachment in Silas's eyes. They were the eyes of a farmer assessing livestock, not of a man mourning the departure of a fellow human being. The empathy felt like a performance, a well-rehearsed part in a play the whole town had agreed to stage. In the days that followed, Sheriff Miller became a silent observer of the town's daily ritual. He watched from his office window as the gaudy, shuffling line formed outside the butcher shop each morning. He saw the desperate hope in their eyes, a hope that was answered by the benevolent figure of Silas Blackwood. The butcher's generosity was the glue holding Haven's dust together, a daily miracle that made the unbearable weight of existence just a little lighter. Miller understood their devotion. It was a rational response to starvation. But this very gratitude had created a powerful, unspoken pact of ignorance. To question the source of the miracle was to risk its cessation, and no one was willing to take that chance. Miller realized he was not just an outsider. He was a heretic in a town that had found its one true God. It was the details that continued to gnaw at him, the small inconsistencies that refused to align. The obsessive cleanliness of the shop seemed less about hygiene and more about erasure, a constant scrubbing away of unseen stains. And then there was the smell. On a particularly hot, still afternoon, while standing near the shop, Miller caught it again. A faint, cloyingly sweet odor seeping from beneath the heavy, bolted door of the back room. It was a scent that was both organic and vaguely chemical, a nauseating perfume of decay masked by the aggressive aroma of pickling spices. Just as he tried to place the scent, Silas emerged from the main door and, seeing the sheriff nearby, gave a polite nod before immediately heading to the smokehouse, stoking the fire until a thick cloud of hickory smoke billowed out, overwhelming the air and scouring away the unsettling sweetness. The logical inconsistencies mounted, forming a case in Miller's mind that was as circumstantial as it was compelling. He began to make discreet inquiries with railroad officials and shipping companies. The records were unequivocal. No significant livestock shipments had arrived in the county for over 18 months. The local farms were barren, their herds long since perished or sold. Every other purveyor of goods in Haven's Dust was struggling with scarcity, their shelves half empty. Yet, Silas Blackwood's hooks remained heavy with what he sold as fresh pork, and his grinder produced an endless supply of specialty sausage. The math was impossible. The supply was an aberration, a violation of the fundamental laws of economics and nature that governed their desperate world. The meat, it seemed, was being conjured from thin air, driven by a growing sense of dread. Miller began to spend his evenings poring over the town's public records from the past 2 years. He cross-referenced census data with church registries and old missing person reports, most of which had been dismissed just as Jedediah's had been. A chilling pattern began to emerge from the dry, bureaucratic pages. The disappearances were not random. The victims were always the most invisible members of the community. Solitary elders without family to ask questions, itinerant farmhands who drifted in and out of town, and those known to be suffering from terminal illnesses. They were the people least likely to be missed, their absence easily explained away. It was a systematic culling of the weakest, a quiet and orderly procession of the forgotten into oblivion. As another dust-reddened sunset bled across the horizon, Sheriff Miller stood at his window, staring at the warm, inviting glow emanating from Blackwood's butcher shop. For the rest of Haven's Dust, that light was a symbol of hope, of charity, of a fragile salvation in a godless time. For Miller, it had become a beacon of profound horror. He could feel the shape of the truth, a monstrous, unthinkable possibility that lurked just beyond the reach of his evidence. He knew that behind that clean, whitewashed facade, a terrible secret was being kept, a secret the town had tacitly agreed to protect. He was one man against a community bound by hunger and fear, and he understood that digging for this truth might unleash a horror from which Haven's Dust would never recover. For weeks, the sky over Haven's Dust had been a relentless, empty canvas of bleached blue, the sun an unblinking eye of judgment. The air was so dry it felt sharp in the lungs, and the dust was a living entity, a fine powder that insinuated itself into every crack and crevice. into the very fabric of life. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive heat gave way to a heavy, suffocating humidity, and the horizon to the west turned the color of a deep bruise. The wind, which had for so long been a hot, abrasive force, fell into an unnerving silence. It was the kind of stillness that precedes violence, a held breath before a scream. The townsfolk watched the darkening sky with a mixture of hope and ancient dread, knowing that the very thing they prayed for, rain, could also be a destructive, uncontrollable power in a land that had forgotten the meaning of moderation. The clouds gathered with unnatural speed, a churning, malevolent mass that swallowed the afternoon sun whole. The first drops of rain were not a gentle blessing but hard, heavy pellets that struck the tin roofs with the sound of thrown gravel. They landed on the parched earth with an audible hiss, each one kicking up a tiny puff of dust before being instantly absorbed. For a moment, the town stood still, its inhabitants emerging onto their porches, faces tilted upward in stunned disbelief. A collective sigh seemed to rise from the community, a sound of profound, almost painful relief. The smell of petrichor, the long-forgotten scent of wet earth, filled the air, a perfume so potent it was almost intoxicating. It was the smell of life, of a promise being fulfilled after years of barren punishment. Children, who had only ever known a world of beige grit, ran into the streets, their mouths open to catch the strange, clean taste of water falling from the sky. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a baptism for a town that believed it had been forsaken. This initial relief, however, was short-lived. The gentle overture quickly escalated into a furious symphony of elemental rage. The sky tore open, unleashing a deluge that was less a rainfall and more a vertical river. The water came down in blinding solid sheets, overwhelming the landscape in a matter of minutes. The dusty, rutted main street of Haven's Dust transformed into a churning, muddy torrent, carrying with it the accumulated debris of a town in decay. The sound was deafening, a constant, roaring percussion that vibrated through the floorboards of the flimsy houses and rattled the glass in their window frames. The parched, cracked earth, unable to absorb such a sudden and violent quantity of water, repelled it, turning every slight depression into a swirling pool and every path into a miniature, raging river. The miracle had become a menace, a biblical flood sent to cleanse a land that had far more to hide than just its dust. The epicenter of this sudden chaos was the desiccated creek bed that ran along the forgotten edge of town, directly behind the row of businesses that included Blackwood's butcher shop. For years, it had been nothing more than a dry, sandy scar, a repository for tumbleweeds and refuse. Now, it was a raging artery of chocolate-brown water, a furious current that tore at the banks and ripped loose the roots of the skeletal cottonwood trees that lined its edges. The floodwater, thick with silt and filth, surged with incredible force, a powerful, indiscriminate conveyor belt of the town's forgotten history. From a large iron-grilled drainage pipe that protruded from the earthen bank directly behind the butcher shop, a particularly dark and viscous stream of water pulsed into the main current. It was a detail no one would have noticed on a normal day, but in the churning chaos of the flood, it was a wound bleeding into the larger torrent, disgorging secrets from the foundations of the town's salvation. Amidst the storm's fury, a small figure of innocence moved with heedless curiosity. 8-year-old Timothy Hargrove, captivated by the dramatic transformation of his world, had slipped out of his house to witness the spectacle. For a boy who had only known drought, the flood was a thrilling, terrifying playground. He stood at the edge of the newly formed riverbank, poking a stick into the muddy, swirling water near the mouth of the large drainage pipe. The water there was discolored, carrying with it a strange, greasy sheen and small, unidentifiable bits of refuse. As he prodded the soft, saturated earth that had been exposed by the scouring current, his stick hit something hard and unyielding just beneath the surface of the muck. It wasn't a rock. It felt different, smaller and with a distinct shape. His curiosity overriding the fear his mother had instilled in him about the dangers of the flood, he knelt down and began to dig with his bare hands. Plunging his small hands into the cold, viscous mud, Timothy's fingers closed around the object. It was smooth and cool, a stark contrast to the gritty slurry surrounding it. With a grunt of effort, he pulled it free. As the caked mud and silt washed away in the relentless rain, a faint glint of silver became visible. It was a small, heart-shaped locket, attached to a delicate, broken chain. Though it was tarnished by its time in the earth and stained by the foul water, its intricate engravings of vines and flowers were still discernible. The boy, possessing no concept of its value or significance, saw it only as a curious treasure, a strange and beautiful secret yielded by the storm. He wiped it as clean as he could on his soaked overalls, the small silver heart feeling impossibly cold in the palm of his hand, a piece of forgotten beauty unearthed by the violent reshaping of the landscape. Timothy ran home, his discovery clutched tightly in his fist, and presented the muddy treasure to his mother. Martha Hargrove, a woman worn thin by years of poverty and worry, initially dismissed it as a piece of junk. But as she cleaned the locket under the sputtering tap of their kitchen pump, she recognized the unmistakable quality of real silver. More importantly, she felt a disquieting sense of familiarity, a ghost of a memory she couldn't quite place. Knowing it was not something to be ignored, she wrapped the locket in a piece of cloth and, once the storm had subsided to a steady drizzle, made her way to the one place where such a strange finding might be properly addressed, the office of Sheriff Lucas Miller. She presented it to him with a simple explanation, her voice barely a whisper. "My boy found this in the mud, Sheriff, down by the creek bed, behind the butcher shop." The specificity of the location hung in the air between them. Sheriff Miller took the locket, his expression unreadable. He placed it on his desk, the small silver heart a stark, incongruous object against the dark, weathered wood. He thanked Mrs. Hargrove and assured her he would look into it. After she left, he sat for a long time, just staring at it. The rain tapped a somber rhythm against the window pane. With the delicate tip of his pocket knife, he carefully worked at the clasp. It was stiff, sealed with grime, but it eventually sprang open with a faint click. Inside, protected by the silver casing, were two tiny, circular frames. One was empty. The other held a miniature, sepia-toned photograph, its surface clouded and damaged by moisture. It depicted the face of a smiling, elderly woman with kind eyes and hair pulled back in a neat bun. Miller felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen that face before, staring out from a faded photograph on a dusty mantelpiece. He rose from his desk and walked to his filing cabinet, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out a thin folder labeled Vance Eleanor. Inside was a missing person report, filed 6 months prior and officially closed a week later. Eleanor Vance, a 72-year-old widow with no living children. The official story, provided by several neighbors and corroborated by Reverend Thompson, was that she had finally accepted an offer to move in with her distant sister in Missouri. Miller remembered visiting her small, tidy home during his initial inquiries, and he remembered the photograph on the mantel, the one of her and her late husband, a man who, she had told a neighbor, had given her a silver locket just like this one on their 50th wedding anniversary. It was her most cherished possession. She was never seen without it. She would have sooner left town without her own skin. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cool. But for Sheriff Miller, the atmosphere had never been more suffocating. The locket was no longer just a piece of lost jewelry. It was a voice from the grave. It was the first piece of tangible, physical evidence that directly contradicted the town's placid narrative of quiet departures. It was an object that had been deliberately discarded, flushed away through a drainage pipe that originated from the back of Silas Blackwood's property, only to be unearthed by an act of God. The unsettling normalcy of Haven's dust had been shattered. The suspicion that had been a quiet hum in the back of Miller's mind now roared with certainty. The time for passive observation was over. The kindly butcher had a question to answer, and Miller now held the proof that the man's benevolence was a facade, hiding a truth more monstrous than the storm itself. With Eleanor Vance's silver locket resting like a cold accusation on his desk, Sheriff Lucas Miller understood that his investigation could no longer be a matter of public record. In Haven's dust, Silas Blackwood was not a citizen to be questioned. He was an institution to be revered. To openly accuse him would be to declare war on the town's very survival, inviting a unified wall of denial and hostility that would bury the truth forever. Miller was a solitary agent of the law in a land that had written its own, far more primal statutes. His work would have to be done in the shadows, a meticulous and silent excavation of a secret the entire community was complicit in protecting. He began to operate on a nocturnal schedule, his true work beginning only when the last lamp in the last desperate house was extinguished, leaving the town to the dust and the ghosts. His first objective was Silas Blackwood's ledger. It was a long shot, a search for a clerical error in a narrative of perfect benevolence. Miller knew the butcher was a man of meticulous habits, a man who likely documented every transaction with the same precision he used to dress a carcass. Gaining access required a violation of the very laws Miller had sworn to uphold. On a moonless Tuesday night, when the wind howled a sufficient cover for his movements, he slipped the simple lock on the back door of the town's records office. He wasn't after the butcher's private property, not yet. He was after the public filings, tax records, supply manifests, and business licenses. He sought a discrepancy in the official story, a single thread he could pull to unravel the entire tapestry of deceit. The office was cold, smelling of brittle paper and stale ink, a repository of mundane facts that Miller hoped would betray a fantastic horror. The hours he spent hunched over the town's financial records by the weak beam of a shielded lantern were grueling and, initially, fruitless. Blackwood's filings were immaculate. His declared income, his expenses, his charitable write-offs, it was all perfectly balanced, a portrait of a modest, hard-working community servant. But Miller was not an accountant. He was a detective, trained to see the patterns behind the numbers. He began to cross-reference the butcher's declared supply purchases with county-wide freight and livestock auction records. It was here that the first undeniable fissure appeared. Blackwood's reported pork and beef acquisitions accounted for less than a third of the volume of meat he was distributing, both through sales and his much-lauded charity. The numbers simply did not add up. The town's salvation was being materialized from a source that had no official, documented existence on any shipping manifest in the state of Oklahoma. This glaring discrepancy provided Miller with the internal justification he needed for his next, more dangerous step. A clandestine entry into the butcher shop itself. He needed to see Silas's private ledger, the true book of accounts that was not meant for the taxman's eyes. Waiting for another stormy night, he approached the shop not from the welcoming front, but from the shadowed alley in the back, the domain of the smokehouse and the grim, bolted door. The main shop's lock was old but sturdy. It took Miller 20 tense minutes of careful work with a set of improvised picks. Every scrape of metal amplified by the silence, every gust of wind sounding like approaching footsteps. When the lock finally clicked open, the sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him, and was immediately enveloped by the thick, complex smells of the butcher's trade. The interior of the shop at night was a place of deep, unsettling shadows. The familiar, reassuring space of the day was transformed into a grotesque tableau. Moonlight filtering through the dusty front window cast a spectral glow on the great oak cutting block, its surface worn into a deep concavity from years of relentless chopping. The long, sharp knives and cleavers hung in a neat, gleaming row on the wall, each one a tool of sustenance that now seemed like an instrument of methodical violence. The air was heavy, the clean smells of sawdust and salt failing to completely mask that other scent. The faint, cloying sweetness that seemed to emanate from the back room door. It was stronger in the still night air, a sickening perfume of hidden decay. Miller fought the urge to turn and leave, forcing his focus onto the small office behind the main counter, where he hoped to find the ledger. He found it exactly where he expected, in the top drawer of a simple wooden desk. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, its cover worn smooth from frequent handling. The pages were filled with Silas Blackwood's handwriting, a surprisingly elegant and precise script that spoke of a disciplined, orderly mind. Miller carried the ledger to the front window, using the faint moonlight to examine its contents. The first several pages confirmed what the public records had shown: meticulous lists of sales, expenses, and charitable donations. It was a testament to a well-run business and a generous spirit, but as Miller delved deeper, turning to the sections detailing inventory and stock, he began to notice a curious and recurring annotation, one that never appeared on any official documents. It was a simple, 3-letter code, written in the margins next to certain entries. S. Santino D. It stood, he surmised, for special sausage delivery. The SS in New York entries appeared with a chilling regularity, roughly once every few weeks. They were always accompanied by a weight, typically between 120 and 180 pounds, and were logged under the heading of procured goods, yet there was never a corresponding entry for a purchase or payment. This was the phantom inventory, the meat that appeared from nowhere. Miller's hands grew cold as he began the grim task of cross-referencing the dates of these entries with his own file of the town's disappearances. The correlation was immediate and absolute. On September 4th, 1937, the day itinerant worker Franklin Moss was last seen, the ledger showed an entry, Silas D. 165 LBS. On January 12, 1938, 2 days after Jedediah Kane was said to have headed west, another entry appeared, SSD. 140 LABs. The ledger was not just a book of accounts, it was a death list. The most damning entry was dated 6 months prior. On May 21, 1937, the day after Eleanor Vance's neighbors reported her departure for Missouri, Silas had written in his elegant script, SSD, 125 LBS. Beside this entry, in a different, fainter ink, was a small, almost poetic notation, a heart of silver for the soil. Miller felt a surge of nausea. The locket. Silas hadn't just disposed of the body. He had documented the disposal of its most identifiable artifact. This wasn't the work of a common murderer. This was the meticulous, almost ritualistic record-keeping of a man who saw his actions not as crimes, but as a form of harvest, a necessary and orderly process. The ledger was a testament to his sanity, which was somehow more terrifying than any madness. It was the calm, rational documentation of an unspeakable, systematic horror that had been feeding the town for years. Miller carefully photographed several key pages of the ledger using a small, portable camera, the click of the shutter, and obscene punctuation in the silence of the shop. He then returned the book to the drawer, precisely as he had found it, and slipped back out into the night, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The evidence he now possessed was irrefutable, but it was also inadmissible, obtained through illegal entry. He couldn't use it to get a warrant, not directly, but it gave him the certainty he needed. It transformed his suspicion into a cold, hard conviction that armed him for the inevitable confrontation. He now understood the full scope of the atrocity, the sheer, calculated evil that hid behind a gentle smile and a pristine white apron. The kindly butcher was a predator, and his flock was the town's most forgotten and vulnerable souls. The next morning, Silas Blackwood seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. As Sheriff Miller walked his daily patrol down the main street, the butcher emerged from his shop, wiping his hands on his apron as he always did. But this time, his gentle smile did not quite reach his eyes. He approached Miller not as a shopkeeper greeting a lawman, but as a king addressing a potentially troublesome courtier. A fine morning after the storm, Sheriff, Silas began, his voice a low, placid rumble. It seems the Lord saw fit to wash the world clean for us. The words were pious, but they carried a subtle undercurrent of warning. He was testing Miller, probing the extent of his knowledge. The sheriff simply nodded, his face an impassive mask, offering a non-committal, "That it is, Mr. Blackwood." A fresh start. The air between them was thick with unspoken accusations and veiled threats. Silas continued, his gaze steady and unnervingly calm, gesturing toward the line of grateful townspeople already forming outside his door. "This town is a fragile thing, Sheriff Miller. It lives on faith. Faith in the Lord, and faith in the kindness of neighbors. You're an outsider. You may not understand the delicate balance we maintain here." It was not a threat of violence, but something far more insidious. It was a reminder of Miller's isolation, an assertion of Silas's absolute power within the community. He was the one who provided the daily bread, or in this case, the daily meat. He was untouchable, protected by the very people Miller was sworn to serve. To move against Silas was to move against the town itself, to threaten the fragile peace that had been purchased at such a terrible, unspoken cost. "Sometimes," Silas added, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "a good shepherd must make difficult choices for the health of the flock. He must cull the weak to ensure the strong survive the winter. It is a hard but necessary truth of nature, Sheriff. A truth that a man of the world, a man like you, surely understands. The metaphor was delivered with the calm assurance of a philosopher explaining a fundamental principle. He was not confessing. He was recruiting, attempting to draw Miller into his worldview, to make him a co-conspirator in the town's grim pact. He was framing his monstrous actions as a form of pragmatic stewardship, a necessary evil for the greater good. In that moment, Miller saw the true face of Silas Blackwood, a man so convinced of his own righteousness that he had erased the line between compassion and butchery. Miller held the butcher's gaze, the weight of the silver locket in his pocket a cold, grounding presence. "The law doesn't make exceptions for the health of the flock, Mr. Blackwood," he replied, his voice even and steady. "It's meant to protect every single soul, especially the weak." He then tipped his hat and continued on his way, leaving Silas standing on the boardwalk. The exchange was a declaration of war, a silent acknowledgement that the pretense was over. Miller knew that Silas would now be on his guard, that he might begin to destroy any remaining evidence. The time for clandestine maneuvering had passed. The intimidation had failed, and in doing so it had backfired, confirming for Miller the butcher's profound and chilling lack of remorse. The monster was not only aware, but he was proud of his work. Returning to his office, Miller locked the door and laid out the photographs of the ledger pages on his desk. The elegant script seemed to mock him, a civilized veneer over a barbaric truth. He could not use these photos to obtain a warrant, but they provided him with a roadmap. They gave him names, dates, and weights. He began to meticulously rebuild the lives of the forgotten, poring over old town records, searching for any last known relatives, no matter how distant. He wrote letters and sent telegrams to addresses in other states, inquiries about missing uncles, grandfathers, and cousins. He was no longer just investigating a series of disappearances. He was building a case for mass murder, piece by painstaking piece, against a man the world saw as a saint. His focus narrowed on the physical location described by the flood, the drainage pipe behind the butcher shop. The locket had been washed out from there. It stood to reason that other, more definitive evidence might have been disposed of in the same manner. Armed with the ledger's dates, he could now theorize what else might be buried in the silt and mud of the creek bed. The recent flood had disturbed the ground, making an excavation both more urgent and more feasible. He needed a legitimate reason to dig back there, a reason that would not immediately alert Silas and the rest of the town. He began to draft a request to the county for a survey of the flood damage, citing concerns about the structural integrity of the town's drainage systems. It was a thin pretext, but it might be enough. The weight of his knowledge was a crushing burden. Every time he saw a neighbor carrying a parcel wrapped in brown butcher paper, a wave of revulsion washed over him. He saw the gaunt faces of the children, their cheeks now holding a bit of color, and he knew the horrific price of their health. The rhythmic thud of Silas's cleaver, once a comforting sound of community life, now echoed in his mind as the percussion of a systematic slaughter. The entire town of Haven's Dust had become a grand, macabre stage, and its inhabitants were unwitting cannibals, feasting on the flesh of their most vulnerable neighbors. They were all victims of Silas Blackwood, some consumed literally, others consumed by a desperate, willful ignorance that had poisoned their very souls. Miller knew he could not bring the truth to light alone. The local deputy was a cousin of the Reverend and would never believe him. He needed an outside authority, a force that was immune to the town's twisted loyalties. He began to compose a detailed, confidential report to the state's district attorney, a man he had met once and who had struck him as being impervious to small-town politics. He outlined his suspicions, the impossible economics of the butcher shop, the pattern of disappearances, and the discovery of the locket. He deliberately omitted the illegal search and the ledger, framing his request for a warrant on the physical evidence and the need to investigate the source of the drainage pipe behind the shop. It was a gamble, a plea for belief from a distant authority. As the sun set, casting long skeletal shadows across the dusty street, Miller stood at his window, watching the light in the butcher shop finally go out. He had all the pieces. He had the names of the victims, the method of the killer, and the chilling philosophy that drove him. All that remained was the final, physical proof, the irrefutable evidence that lay hidden somewhere behind that heavy, dark, and permanently bolted door. He had challenged the town's savior, and now he had to prepare for the consequences. The storm that had brought the locket to the surface was over, but Miller knew a far more terrible storm was about to break over Haven's Dust, a storm of truth that would wash away the town's innocence and reveal the monstrous secret at its heart. Sheriff Miller's confidential telegram to the state capitol did not go unanswered. 3 days later, a black Ford sedan, its polished exterior an alien sight against the dusty backdrop of Haven's Dust, rolled into town, carrying 2 grim-faced men in dark suits. They were state investigators, dispatched by the district attorney, and they moved with an air of authority that was utterly immune to the town's unspoken social contracts. They reviewed Miller's report in his small and cramped office, their expressions hardening as they connected the disappearance of Eleanor Vance to the silver locket now sealed in an evidence bag. They were not interested in Silas Blackwood's reputation as a community pillar. They were interested in the cold, hard calculus of the law. Armed with Miller's meticulous groundwork and the authority of the state, a search warrant was formally issued, its language cold and precise, transforming a town's dark suspicion into an official inquisition from which there could be no retreat. The serving of the warrant was a public spectacle, a piece of theater that brought the entire town to a standstill. Sheriff Miller, flanked by the 2 imposing state officers, walked the length of Main Street in the harsh light of midday. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Every porch was filled with silent, gaunt figures. When they reached the butcher shop, Silas Blackwood was waiting for them, standing in the doorway with his hands placidly clasped over his clean white apron. He did not seem surprised, merely disappointed, like a patient father confronting a disobedient child. "Sheriff Miller," he said, his voice a low, sorrowful hum. "To what do I owe this intrusion? Has my charity finally become a crime in these hard times?" His performance was masterful, casting him as the victim of an unjust persecution, a final attempt to rally the town to his side before the truth could be unsealed. The initial search of the main shop yielded precisely what Miller expected. Nothing. The space was a testament to obsessive cleanliness. The floors were scrubbed. The counters were bleached to a pale white, and the gleaming meat hooks hung empty, as if awaiting a fresh delivery. Silas watched the proceedings with an unnerving calm, offering polite assistance and answering questions with a practiced air of weary patience. He seemed to be savoring the investigators' fruitless efforts, his placid demeanor a form of psychological warfare. The tension in the small shop grew thick and suffocating as the investigators, finding no irregularities, finally turned their attention to the one area that remained unseen. Their gazes fell upon the heavy, dark wood of the back room door, the threshold between the town's salvation and Miller's monstrous theory. The moment of truth, one way or another, had finally arrived for Haven's Dust. The door was, as always, bolted from the inside. When asked for the key, Silas offered a gentle, almost apologetic shrug. "I'm afraid it was lost long ago. Gentlemen, it's just a storage room. Nothing of interest back there." His lie was smooth, delivered without a flicker of hesitation. One of the state investigators retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from their vehicle. The first attempt to pry the door open was met with the groan of stressed timber. The second blow caused the wood around the lock to splinter. With a final, violent crack that echoed through the silent, watching town like a rifle shot, the door burst inward, torn from its hinges. It was a sound of violation, the definitive and irreversible shattering of the community's willful ignorance. The barrier that had protected the town's dark secret for so long had been brutally breached, and the air that spilled out from the darkness beyond was immediately, shockingly different. The smell that met them was not the expected stench of a slaughterhouse or the cloying rot of decay. It was a sharp, sterile, chemical odor, reminiscent of a hospital or a mortuary, with the faint, Swedish undertone that Miller now recognized with a sickening certainty. The room was not a place of chaotic butchery, but of meticulous, almost surgical order. The walls were covered not in wood, but in pristine, white ceramic tiles that reached from the floor to the ceiling, every surface scrubbed and gleaming under the harsh light of the investigators' lanterns. There was no sawdust, no bloodstains, only the cold, impersonal sterility of a laboratory designed for a single, gruesome purpose. The stark cleanliness of the chamber was somehow more terrifying than any scene of overt carnage could have been. It spoke not of a crime of passion, but of a cold, rational, and oft-repeated process. In the center of the tiled room stood a large, stainless steel table, its surface canted at a slight angle and grooved to channel liquids toward a large, iron-grated drain in the floor. It was a custom piece of equipment, clearly designed for efficient and clean disassembly. On a smaller table against the far wall, an array of tools was laid out with the precision of a surgeon's instrument tray. Alongside the familiar cleavers and boning knives were tools of a more disturbing nature: hacksaws with fine-toothed blades, surgical scalpels of varying sizes, and heavy, chrome-plated clamps. Every tool was immaculately clean, polished to a mirror shine, their deadly purpose masked by their sterile presentation. This was not a butcher's back room. It was an altar of deconstruction, a place where the human form was systematically reduced to its component parts with chilling, industrial efficiency. One of the investigators knelt, using the tip of the crowbar to pry open the heavy iron grate of the central floor drain. As the grate lifted, the sweet, metallic odor intensified, rising from the darkness below in a nauseating wave. The drain pipe was wider than standard plumbing would require, and its insides were coated with a thick, greasy, organic residue. Swirling the beam of his flashlight into the trap, the investigator exposed the source of the blockage that had likely caused the locket to be disgorged during the flood. Caught in the bend of the pipe were small, pale fragments that were unmistakably bone, chipped and sawed with a terrible precision. Alongside them were clumps of fibrous tissue and strands of dark, human hair, a grim testament to the countless secrets that had been washed down this drain, flushed away from sight but not from existence. While the investigators examined the gruesome contents of the drain, Sheriff Miller's attention was drawn to the floor. His eyes traced the perfect grid of the white tiles, searching for any imperfection in the room's chilling symmetry. He found it in the far corner, partially hidden beneath the tool table, a small section of tiles, roughly 4 feet square, where the grout lines were slightly wider, the color a fraction of a shade off from the rest. Kneeling down, he tapped the suspect tiles with the handle of his service revolver. Instead of the solid thud of concrete, the sound was hollow, resonant. He scraped away the grout with his knife, revealing the clear, unmistakable seams of a hidden trapdoor, its edges expertly cut and fitted to blend seamlessly into the floor. It was a secret entrance, leading from this sterile processing room down into the earth itself, into the final and hidden chamber of Silas Blackwood's operation. With a concerted effort, they wedged the crowbar into the seam and heaved. The trapdoor lifted with a scraping groan, revealing a set of steep, narrow wooden steps descending into a black air, suffocating darkness. A wave of cold, stagnant air, thick with the concentrated odor of damp earth and old blood, rushed up from the opening, a foul exhalation from the very bowels of the earth. The smell was ancient and profound, the smell of a mass grave. Taking a deep breath, Miller led the way, his lantern beam cutting a shaky path down into the root cellar below. The air grew colder with each step, the silence absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the drip of condensation from the earthen walls. The light played across rough-hewn shelves and dark, ominous shapes, slowly revealing the full, unthinkable scope of the butcher's secret larder. The cellar was not a place of chaotic horror, but of chilling, systematic organization. The lantern light fell upon rows of neatly arranged shelves that lined the damp, earthen walls. On these shelves sat large ceramic crocks, each sealed with a thick layer of wax and marked with a stenciled number. Beside them were dozens of heavy, rectangular parcels, wrapped tightly in oilcloth and twine, stacked like bricks of some unspeakable currency. It was a pantry of the damned, a library of human remains. On a small, rickety table in the corner sat several small wooden boxes. One of the investigators opened the nearest one. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a pair of cracked spectacles, a tarnished silver thimble booze, and a single, chipped porcelain tooth. Each box contained the last, indigestible remnants of a human life, a catalog of the souls who had been processed in the room above. The state officers, their faces pale and set like stone, forced open one of the waxed crocks. The contents confirmed their worst fears: preserved organs and select cuts of meat, pickled in a dark, viscous brine. They unwrapped one of the oilcloth parcels to find a human thigh, expertly butchered and packed in salt, the flesh pale and firm. The sheer volume of remains was staggering, far exceeding the number of official disappearances Miller had documented. The cellar held the grim harvest of years, a silent, waiting inventory of the town's forgotten. As the investigators stood in stunned, horrified silence, one of them finally broke, turning away to retch violently into the dark corner of the cellar. The truth was absolute, undeniable, and more monstrous than any of them could have possibly imagined. The kindly butcher had not just been a murderer, he had been a provisioner of horrors. They brought Silas Blackwood down the narrow steps and into the cold, fetid air of his secret cellar. He descended without resistance, his face a mask of placid indifference. As his eyes adjusted to the lantern light, he surveyed the shelves of his life's work not with fear or shame, but with the quiet, proprietary satisfaction of a master craftsman. He looked at the numbered crocks and the neatly stacked parcels of salted flesh as a librarian might look upon his collection of rare books. The investigators stared at him, their faces a mixture of revulsion and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the gentle, pious man from the sunlit street with the architect of this subterranean nightmare. Sheriff Miller finally broke the silence, his voice low and raw with fury. "Silas, in God's name, why?" The question hung in the cold, dead air, a plea for a sane reason in a world that had just been proven utterly insane. Silas turned his calm, gentle eyes toward the sheriff, and for the first time, Miller saw not piety, but an unshakable, profound conviction. "I didn't kill them, Sheriff," he said, his voice as even and measured as if he were explaining a cut of meat. "Death had already claimed them. Sickness, starvation, despair, they were already gone. I simply harvested what was left. I gave their last ounce of substance a purpose beyond feeding the worms." He gestured to the shelves, a curator presenting his finest exhibit. These people were a burden to themselves and to a town that had nothing left to give. They were the weakest of the flock. I took their meaningless ends and transformed them into a means for others to survive. I gave them a use. I gave them a meaning. His confession was not an apology. It was a manifesto, the chillingly rational philosophy of a monster who believed himself a savior. He took a step closer to Miller, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his gaze unwavering. "This room, Sheriff, is the only reason Haven's Dust still exists. This cellar is the foundation upon which this town's survival was built. The people came to me, hungry and hopeless, and I fed them. I gave them the miracle they prayed for. You call me a monster, but for years, the good people of this town called me a saint." He paused, a faint, beatific smile gracing his lips as he delivered his final, blasphemous truth. "Every week, they lined up for my charity. Every Sunday, they praised the Lord for their full bellies. They ate the body of their neighbor, and with every bite, they called it grace. Tell me, Sheriff, who is the real monster here? The shepherd who culls the flock, or the sheep who feast on the fallen and never ask the price?" The immediate aftermath of the discovery was not one of righteous anger, but of a profound paralytic shock that seized Haven's Dust and squeezed the very breath from its collective lungs. The revelation of what Silas Blackwood had done, and more terribly, what they had been consuming, spread not like a wildfire but like a creeping, ice-cold flood. A sickening silence descended upon the town, heavier and more suffocating than any dust storm. Neighbors who had once shared parcels of the butcher's charity could no longer meet each other's gaze, for in every face they saw a reflection of their own horrific, unwitting complicity. The butcher shop, cordoned off with yellow tape, became an overnight leper in the town's landscape, a place so saturated with evil that the sun itself seemed to bend around it. The rhythmic thud of the cleaver was gone, replaced by a silence that screamed the truth they had all chosen to ignore for so long. The trial of Silas Blackwood became a national sensation, a macabre spectacle that drew reporters and curiosity seekers from across the country. They descended upon the small, forgotten town like vultures, eager to pick at the bones of its grotesque secret. Newspapers dubbed him the Butcher of the Dust Bowl and the Kindly Cannibal, transforming the local savior into a figure of national folklore overnight. Throughout the proceedings, Silas remained unnervingly calm, his demeanor that of a patient teacher explaining a complex but necessary truth. He offered no plea of insanity, no claims of madness. Instead, He laid out his chillingly rational philosophy of pragmatic survival, forcing the jury and a horrified nation to confront the brutal calculus of starvation. His lack of remorse was his most terrifying attribute. He was not a monster who had lost his mind, but one who was utterly, unshakably convinced of his own righteousness. And that was a far more profound horror. The testimonies of the townspeople became a public confession of their collective, willful blindness. One by one, they took the stand, their voices hollow with shame, recounting the small, unsettling details they had chosen to overlook: the strange, sweetish smell, the impossible abundance of meat, the quiet disappearance of their most vulnerable neighbors. Reverend Thompson, his face a mask of spiritual agony, admitted he had praised Silas from the pulpit, calling his provisions a gift from God. The prosecution painted a picture of a cunning predator who had expertly exploited a community's desperation, while Silas's court-appointed lawyer could offer little defense against the mountain of physical evidence and his client's own calm, detailed confession. The trial was not about determining guilt, which was a foregone conclusion, but about forcing an entire town to stare into the abyss of its own moral compromises, an act of penance performed under the harsh glare of the public eye. Ultimately, the verdict was swift and the sentence absolute: death. Yet, for the people of Haven's Dust, the execution of Silas Blackwood offered no catharsis, no cleansing of the soul. His death merely silenced the man who had architected their damnation, but it could not erase the knowledge of their participation in it. When the reporters packed up their cameras and the curiosity seekers drove away, the town was left alone with its poisoned legacy. The name Haven's Dust became a permanent stain, a national shorthand for a uniquely American horror story. The community had survived the Great Depression, but it had traded its soul for a full belly, and the ghost of that terrible bargain would haunt its streets and its bloodlines for generations to come. A quiet, incurable sickness of the spirit that no verdict could ever hope to remedy. The butcher shop itself was never torn down. It was simply left to rot, a skeletal monument to the town's darkest chapter. The whitewashed facade peeled away to reveal the dark, decaying timber beneath, like a mask of civility being stripped from a monstrous face. The windows shattered, becoming vacant eyes staring out at a town that tried desperately to forget. Over the decades, the roof collapsed, and the immaculate white tiles of the back room cracked and grew filmed with grime. As if the evil accreted there was a physical substance, locals claimed that the earth itself rejected the place. No weeds would grow near its foundation, and the ground around the old drainage pipe remained perpetually damp and foul-smelling. The building became a physical manifestation of the town's trauma, a place of profound dread that was both shunned and morbidly revered, a permanent fixture in the landscape of their collective nightmare. The psychological scars inflicted upon the community were deep and septic. The simple act of eating a meal became fraught with a quiet horror. Many families in Haven's Dust forswore meat entirely, a penitent tradition passed down through generations who only vaguely understood its origin. A deep, corrosive suspicion replaced the trust that had once bound the small community together. The bonds of neighborliness had been severed by the terrible secret they had shared at their dinner tables. The population of Haven's Dust began a slow, steady decline in the years that followed, not because of economic hardship, but because the town's very name was a burden too heavy to bear. To be from Haven's Dust was to be from a place where survival had been purchased at an unspeakable price, a legacy of cannibalism that tainted every birth and shadowed every grave. As the years passed, the documented history of Silas Blackwood began its inevitable transformation into macabre folklore. The horrifying facts of the case softened at the edges, blurring into the more palatable shape of a ghost story. The kindly butcher became a local boogeyman, a tale whispered by grandparents to frighten children into behaving. It was said that on still, moonless nights, the faint, rhythmic sound of a cleaver striking an oak block could be heard echoing from the ruins. Teenagers dared one another to spend a night within its crumbling walls, claiming a permanent, chilling cold emanated from the spot where the cellar trapdoor once lay. The cloying, sweet smell of decay was said to rise from the parched earth on the hottest days of summer, a phantom scent from a phantom crime, ensuring that even as memory faded, the horror would remain a visceral, living presence in the town. From a historical perspective, the case of Silas Blackwood remains a chilling and singular study in the pathology of survival. It stands apart from other instances of survival cannibalism, which are typically born of immediate or desperate circumstances. Blackwood's operation was systematic, prolonged, and chillingly rational. He did not kill in a frenzy of hunger, but harvested with the dispassionate efficiency of a farmer. He was a creature of the Great Depression, a monster forged in the crucible of absolute scarcity. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable question: where is the precise line between victim and accomplice? The people of Haven's Dust were undoubtedly victims of Blackwood's horrific deception, but their desperate, willful refusal to question the miracle laid before them made them unwitting cogs in his machine of death. Today, very little remains of Haven's Dust. It is a ghost of a ghost town. A few crumbling foundations and a rusted signpost swallowed by the vast, indifferent plains of Oklahoma. The land has healed, the dust has settled, but the story endures. The official records, Sheriff Miller's meticulous reports, the lurid trial transcripts, and the ghastly crime scene photographs are preserved in state archives, a cold, bureaucratic testament to a time when civilization wore thin. The legend of the kindly butcher serves as a brutal reminder that the most profound horrors are often not the product of supernatural evil, but of human logic applied to an inhuman situation. It poses a final, lingering question that echoes from the past. Was Silas Blackwood an anomaly, a singular monster, or was he merely the one man in Haven's Dust who had the courage and the cruelty to do what the town's collective hunger silently demanded? The story of Silas Blackwood proves that the darkest chapters of our history are not always buried in forgotten tombs, but are sometimes recorded in plain sight, in the mundane entries of a butcher's ledger. The echoes of his cleaver can still be heard in the tales that drift across the plains, a chilling reminder that the line between salvation and damnation is terrifyingly thin. These stories, these historical wounds, must be remembered, for they are the guardians of our own humanity. To ensure that these vital, terrifying memories are never lost to the dust of time, and to continue our mission of unsealing the archives of the forgotten, subscribe to our channel. Help us guarantee that the shadows of the past are never truly erased.